Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirala Greenwald. This is a Sikha from Lakuta Sichas, Chelek Tazayin, Parshas Pekudei, Sikha Aleph. And the topic of the Sikha is that in this week's Parsha, we learn how Moshe Rabbeinu gave over to the Yidden the Tzivui of Hashem about the Trumas Mishkan and the Tzivui of Hashem about the building of the Mishkan. And it's told to us with all of its details. And then we learn how the Yidden implemented these tzivuyim, and again, it's told to us with all of its details. And there are 6 parts in the Sikha. The Rebbe will, number 1, ask what the explanation is for Rashi, in Pshut Yisham Mikra, for all this repetition. The Torah told us already in Parshas Truma Tetzava about the Trumas HaMishkan and the building of the Mishkan with its details. So why does the Torah again repeat it in our Parsha twice? Number 2, present a partial answer and reject it. Number 3, present an answer to the question. Number 4, ask and answer a question on this answer. Number 5, based on this, explain a detail in a different Rashi. And number 6, present all of this and the meaning of all of it in Pnimis HaInyanim. We already explained many times that Rashi in his Pirush, in his commentary on the Torah, addresses and explains every matter that lacks explanation in Pshut Yisham Mikra. And when Rashi doesn't have an explanation for something, so he writes, I don't know, because his job is to address every single question. Therefore, when something seems to be difficult in the understanding of the Psukim, so we must say one of 2 things. Either that it's not really a difficulty, and the answer is self-understood, or that it's understood and answered based on an earlier teaching of Rashi. So Rashi did address this question by giving us the information to answer it in an earlier Rashi. According to this, there's a difficulty. In the current Parshas, there's something which isn't understood in Pshut Yisham Mikra, and Rashi doesn't address it. In Parshas Vayakel, the Torah recounts how Moshe Rabbeinu gave over to the Yidden the Tzivui of Hashem regarding the Trumas HaMishkan, and it spells out all of its details, like you can see on the scroll on the right. And afterwards, how he gave over the Tzivui regarding the making of the Mishkan and its Kalim, and it spells out all of its details, like you can see in the next scroll. Then afterwards, the Torah recounts how the Yidden brought the donations for the work of making the Mishkan, and then it relates, and with all the details, how the Chachmei Lev made the Mishkan. It talks about the Yerias, all the Kalim, and then in our Parsha, the Big Day Kuna. And L'cha'era, it would be enough to just state, as it does in many places, that Moshe gave over to the Yidden the whole tzivui of Hashem to make the Mishkan, and then it would state, Vayasu b'nei Yisrael k'chol asher tzivah Hashem es Moshe. There's no need for the Torah to repeat all the details each time. We have 3 times over here. We have Hashem giving the command to Moshe, we have Moshe giving the command to the Yidden, and then we have the Yidden fulfilling the command. It would seem that it's enough that in the command of Hashem to Moshe, all the details are spelled out, and then it would say Moshe gave the command to the Yidden, and then finally the Yidden fulfilled the command. Or it would even just state, Vayasu b'nei Yisrael k'chol asher tzivah Hashem es Moshe. It would just say that the Yidden fulfilled the command without saying that Moshe told them the command, and we'd understand that he told them the command. Why does the Torah have to go and in each of these things mention all the details? The Torah tells us the command of Hashem to Moshe, and then it says all the details of the Trumas HaMishkan and of the making of the Mishkan. Then it says how Moshe Rabbeinu gave these commands over to the Yidden, and it says them in all of their details. And then it says how the Yidden fulfilled the command, and again it says it with all the details. And this difficulty is especially since Rashi says in the beginning of Parshas Vayakel, when it says how Moshe gave the command to the Yidden, he says that Kvar pirashti nidvas hamishkan umlachte b'mkoim tzavasan. I already explained all the details of what's going to be spoken about over here in the command when Hashem gave it to Moshe, which indicates that there's nothing new over here, and therefore there's no need for Rashi to teach anything. So if Rashi doesn't have to teach anything on this, because there's nothing new in it, so certainly the Torah shouldn't repeat itself. And this is a question in Pshut Yisham Mikra that many Mefarshim address, and in Rashi we don't find any answer to this question. And this question is especially difficult since Rashi teaches earlier in Parshas Kisisa why the Torah repeats just a few words of Loisav Ashlag Di B'Chali Vimei 3 times. So over here, when we have entire parshias repeated, Rashi should certainly address it and explain why it's being done. Now, l'chayra, part of this question is answered based on a teaching of Rashi in the pasuk, where it says of Etzalel ben Uri, "Asa is kol asher tziva Hashem es Moshe." Rashi says that Moshe tziva leBetzalel la'aseh tzchila kelim va'achar kach mishkan. That Moshe instructed Betzalel to first make the kelim that were in the Mishkan, and then afterwards to build the Mishkan. Amar le Betzalel, Betzalel said to him, Minig olam la'aseh tzchila bayis va'achar kach mesim kelim b'seichei. The way things are done is that first a person builds a home and then puts kelim in it. Amar loi, so Moshe responded to Betzalel, Kach shamayte mi pi HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You're right, that's exactly what I actually heard from Hashem. V'chein asa, and that's what he did. HaMishkan tchila va'achar kach asa kelim. First he made the Mishkan and afterwards he made the kelim. And so that's why the Torah tells us when and how Betzalel did the building of the Mishkan, so that we should see the difference. We should see this change, that Betzalel did it differently than the way Moshe originally set it over, so we can see this idea. So that would be the explanation for why the Torah tells us the details, so we should see this difference, this change that Betzalel made. However, this is not a good enough answer, because in addition to the fact that according to this, it doesn't answer at all why it's all repeated when Moshe gave over the command to the Yidden. It's only telling us why it's repeated when Betzalel actually built it, but it's not talking about when the command was given over. It also doesn't answer, number one, why it teaches about the making of the Kalim and Bigdei Kuna. It just has to say that he built the Mishkan, and then everything else was done, and we know the Mishkan was done before the Kalim. Number two, more importantly, this doesn't require mentioning the details, like their measurements. It could just say he built the Mishkan without getting into all the details. And also, in addition, after the repetition, when it says Vayaviu es Mishkan al Moshe, it says that they brought the Mishkan to Moshe. So this is the third question now. The Torah again repeats all the details of the Mishkan and the Kalim. So we have a fourth time. We have in the command of Hashem to Moshe, the command of Moshe to the Yidden, and the making of it, and then when they brought it to Moshe. And number four, the Torah then finally concludes, Kachol asher tziva Hashem es Moshe kein asu b'nei Yisrael is kol aveda. So we have it mentioned four times, and then the Torah finally says that Yidden did everything they were told. The explanation of this very simply is the Mishkan and the Kalim are from the most important and cherished inyanim by the Yidden, because it brought the Hashras HaShechina by the Yidden. And this is especially since the Mishkan is called, as Rashi says in our parasha at the very beginning, Mishkan HaEdus. It's called Mishkan HaEdus because Edus liYisrael sheviter l'HaKadosh Baruch Hu al Maaseh Egel. It's an Edus, a testimony to the Yidden that Hashem forgave them for the Maaseh Egel. Sharei hishra shchinasa b'neim, because he was masra, he rested his shchina among them. So from this, it's even better understood how cherished and important of an inyan it is, because the Chet Egel is the greatest and most general, all-encompassing Chet, which brought about the greatest concealment of Hashem. And it brought about also a decree of annihilation, Rahman al-Islam. And it's to the extent that even after the forgiveness, Hashem said, that it'll always be there. So therefore it's understood, on the other hand, that how great the Mishkan was, that it undid the Chet Egel. And so therefore it's understood that this great cherishing of the Mishkan by Hashem in the Yidden is the reason the Torah repeats all the details of the Mishkan over and over again, and each time with all of its details. It's an expression of how cherished and beloved it is. And regarding our question, why doesn't Rashi give this explanation in order to answer the question that we had? So the reason Rashi doesn't need to explain this here is because he already explained it earlier in Parshas Chayei Sarah. Rashi already taught us the idea. Rashi explains in regards to the Torah repeating all the details of the story of Eliezer Eved Avram going to bring Yitzchak. It repeats it when Eliezer is telling Rivka's family what happened, and he goes through everything that happened again. So Rashi says that Amar Rabbi Acha said, Yofa sichasin shel avdei avis lifnei hamakim mitorasin shel banim. That the sicha of the servants of the avis is more beloved by Hashem than the Torah of the children. Sharei Parsha Shel Eliezer Kfulo Batera, because the Parsha of Eliezer is repeated. It's written twice in the Torah. V'har begufei Torah le'nitnu ela b'remiza, and many teachings in the Torah are only taught in a hint. So we see that the Torah, we see from here that the Torah repeats something which is cherished by Hashem, even if there's nothing new that's taught. So Rashi already taught this to us, and therefore he doesn't repeat it again. We already know this idea. So that's the final answer to our question, and we're going to remain with that answer. However, we're going to have a side question on this. We have a question on this answer, which we're going to answer. So the final answer that we just gave remains. We're just going to address a possible question on this, which is, however, we have to understand. From this Rashi itself, we actually see that the opposite is true. Because what does it mean, Yafa sichasin shel avdei avis lifnei hamokim miterasin shel banim? What it's saying is that by terasin shel banim, after Matan Torah, we don't find such a cherishing that would lead to repeating something as we find it done by sichasin shel avdei avis. He says, Yafa sichasin shel avdei avis lifnei hamokim miterasin shel banim, that the sicha of avdei avis is repeated, and terasin shel banim is not repeated, because if it is repeated, then we don't see that it's Yafa Sichasin Shel Avdei Avis. We only see it because this over here is repeated, and by Terasin Shel Banim, the Terasin Shel Banim after Matan Torah, we don't find any of it repeated. So this is unique to the Sicha of Avdei Avis. So it seems that this Rashi actually is saying the opposite of the explanation that we're giving over here based on Rashi. The explanation is the meaning of Yafa Sichasin Shel Avdei Avis Lifnei Hamokim Miterasin Shel Banim isn't coming to emphasize the greatness of Avdei Avis over the Banim. It's not saying that the Avdei Avis are greater than the Banim. That's not the point, but rather to emphasize the greatness sometimes in Sicha over Torah. The point of this teaching of Rabbi Acha, as we'll see, we're going to mention it again, is to say the greatness of Sicha over Torah, and therefore, since it's so great, so sometimes the Sicha of Avdei Avis will be greater even than the Torah of Banim, but a Sicha of the Banim will be just as great or even greater. Now, what's the difference between Torah and Sicha? The difference between them is by Torah means Hayrois, Tzivuyim, Dinim, that Hashem said what and how to do something. It's an instruction, it's a mitzvah, it's a command. That's what Torah is. What is Sicha? Sicha is speech that openly and simply, when we look at it, it isn't a Hayra, a Tzivuy, and a Din. Of course, there's something to learn from it. It's in the Torah. But openly, it's not a command, a mitzvah, an instruction that's being given. But rather, it's a story that relates a situation, an event, an activity, like by Eliezer, it's relating something that happened. And this teaching of Rabbi Acha is emphasizing the greatness of Sicha, that sometimes the Sicha, even of Avdei Avis, since Sicha is so great, so even the Sicha of Avdei Avis can be greater than the Torah, even of Banim. But if it's a Sicha of the Banim, it'll be just as great or even greater. And so therefore, when we look at the Sicha that we're talking about over here, about the repetition of all the details of the Mishkan, that's considered a Sicha. Because once we learn in Trum Tetzaveh the mitzvahs that Hashem gave Moshe Rabbeinu, so afterwards when he relates that Moshe Rabbeinu told the Yidden this mitzvah with all of the details, and then that the Yidden fulfilled this mitzvah with all of the details, and then they brought the Mishkan to Moshe Rabbeinu with all of the details, all of that, they are not Hayrois, Tzivuyim, and Dinim. That was already told in Trum Tetzaveh. So this is going to be categorized and classified as Sicha. And so, since we're talking about the Sicha of the Mishkan, and like we said, the Mishkan is something which is so beloved and cherished, so that's why the Torah repeats it over and over and over again, and with all of the details. Now we're going to present a related point that supports this understanding of the teaching of Rabbi Acha. We're going to present it in two parts because it's a little long. So it's in a gray arrow pointing upwards to indicate that it's supporting what we just learned. According to this, we can understand the reason that Rashi quotes the name of Rabbi Acha in his teaching. Because as we know, Rashi doesn't usually tell us the name of the author of the teaching. And if he does, it's because it adds in understanding his teaching. By quoting his name, Rashi teaches us that the emphasis in his teaching, in Rabbi Acha's teaching, is about the greatness of Sicha over Torah. and not the greatness of Avdi Avis over the Banim. Like we explained, the whole idea of this teaching of Rabbi Acha is to tell us the greatness of Sicha over Torah, and therefore sometimes we'll find the Sicha being repeated over and over again, like we do find by Eliezer, even Avdi Avis, and like we find over here even more times by the Banim, by the command and the fulfillment of the command of building the Mishkan and the Nidvas HaMishkan. The way this is connected with Rabbi Acha is because in Maseches Yuma it teaches the Brisa. It says over there, Tana Rabbanon, the Rabbanon taught in the Brisa. It says, "V'dibarta bam," you should talk in them, bam v'lei betfila, in them in the words of Torah and not in the words of Tefillah. Rashi explains this means that you should talk in the words of Torah out loud and not in Tefillah out loud. Tefillah has to be said quietly. And then it continues, "V'dibarta bam," you should speak in them. Bam yesh lecha rishus l'daber. In them you have permission to speak. V'lei b'dvarim acherim, but you can't speak in other things. Meaning, in general, we're referring to dvarim b'telim. The Brisa continues. Rabbi Acha Eimer. Rabbi Acha says, "V'dibarta bam." You should speak in them. Asay oisan keva va'al tasem arei. You should make them something permanent, something fixed, and not something temporary. Now, l'cheira, since Rabbi Acha only says the chiyuv regarding divrei Torah, the positive that V'dibarta bam, what should you do with them? Asay oisan keva va'al tasem arei. Make them permanent and not temporary. And it doesn't say the shlila by dvarim acherim. He doesn't say what about the not doing, about the negation of dvarim acherim, like his Bar Plukta says that bam yesh lecha rishus l'daber v'lei b'dvarim acherim. So it implies that according to Rabbi Acha, there's no shlila that applies by dvarim acherim. However, can we say that according to Rabbi Acha, there's a heter for dvarim acherim, for dvarim b'telim? And so the explanation is, Rabbi Acha is emphasizing that regarding divrei Torah, there's a constant and absolute chiyuv of a dibarta bam, and in a way of keva and not arei. However, regarding dvarim acherim, we cannot negate them in an absolute way. So in other words, what we're saying over here is that Tanakama, when he says bam, meaning things of Torah, he's referring to all things of Torah. And so the other category is dvarim acherim, dvarim betelim. However, Rabbi Acha, when he says bam in Torah, he's referring to the herois dinim and sivuyim. And what's the other category? It's also Torah, but it's sicha. So, however, regarding dvarim acherim, we cannot negate them in an absolute way, because there are things that are dvarim acherim of sicha. They aren't dvarim acherim betelim. Those things are for sure not permitted, but they also aren't divrei Torah. Meaning they're not herois tzivum and dinim. Rather, they are stories and things that inspire in Yanim of Osiris. And there can be such a sicha that is yafa miterasan. And nevertheless, the tzivui of asay eis and kev of al tasim ara is only applies to Torah, not to Yanim of sicha, even though they're part of Torah, because it's self-understood that we must, when we're talking about Torah, meaning in Yanim that are herois tzivuyim and dinim. So it's self-understood that we must always remember the areas of what we must do and what we must not do, and therefore a person has to constantly learn them in order not to forget them. And so that's we see over here from Rabbi Acha, that he speaks about the existence of dvarim acherim, meaning the sicha, and its importance, and the existence of it and the importance of it. It's just that it's not a constant thing. It's not something which is keva, like Torah, which has to be keva, since it's the way a yid behaves, what to do and what not to do, which is something a yid has to always know and make sure to learn over and over again, so that one doesn't forget them, so one remembers what has to be done and what's not allowed to be done. And we'll conclude with explanation of this in Pnimis Inyanim. We're going to talk about how we said that the Inyanim of the Mishkan over here are classified as Inyanim of Sicha, because there's no open herois, tzivuyim, and dinim. Here we're going to explain in Pnimis Inyanim how you could classify them not just as Sicha, but as Sichasan of Avdei Avis. Like Rabbi Acha says, Yafa Sichasan shel Avdei Avis. In Pnimis Inyanim, this is an Inyan of Sichasan shel Avdei Avis. In the two parshias, where all the details of the Mishkan and its Kelim are repeated, there are two general points. Number one is the Nedivas Halev, the generosity of the Yidden, that is coming from their heart, that they brought, and with the greatest zrizus, everything that was needed for the Mishkan, to the extent that they needed to announce Al Yasu Eid Malacha. They had to make an announcement. Nobody should bring any more, and it was Vahista. They brought more than what was needed. And then the second point is that the Chachmei Lev fulfilled the tzivui of Hashem, and they did the Melechas HaMishkan. They did the Melechas HaMishkan, and they made the Kelim K'chol Asher Tziva Hashem Es Moshe. So we have over here 2 points. We have the Nedivus Alev, and we have the fulfillment of the tzivui. In greater detail, we actually see the scholars of these 2 points. That also by bringing the donations to the Mishkan, it was fulfilling the tzivui of Yichuli Truma Meis Kol Isha Shayidvenu Libay. So also in the Nedivus Alev, we see the idea of a tzivui, and also by the Chachmei Lev that we're doing the tzivui, it says Nesar Libay. We see the idea of Lev. So we have over here Nedivus Alev and tzivui, and in each of them we have the other one there as well. According to this, we can see how we have here both in Yonim of Sicha and Avdei. Sicha is connected to Lev, because Sicha is the inyan of Tefillah, like it says, Vayetze Yitzchak L'suach Basada, and that's referring to Tefillah. And Tefillah is Avodah Shebalev. So we have over here the idea of Sicha, the idea of Nedivus Alev is the Sicha part. And Eved emphasizes the inyan of doing mitzvahs, because that's the whole inyan of an Eved, to do the will of his master. And so you have the Eved when it comes to the part that they fulfilled the tzivui. And what we learn over here is that there must be the scholars of both. Meaning, doing mitzvahs, which is the inyan of Eved, has to be with Nedivus Alev. Even the doing mitzvahs, which is the Eved part, it has to be done with Nedivus Alev, just like it says by the Chachmei Lev who did the tzivui, Nisai Libay. And in the Nedivus Alev, you have to feel that it's because of the tzivui of Hashem. Like we see that when it came to the donations that came from Nedivus Alev, they were doing it as a tzivui of Hashem.